I want to start a little message series, maybe just for about 2 or 3 weeks, on relationships. You know, we've been thinking over the past several weeks about thinking differently and the choices, behaviors, actions that we make, that we take as a result of that. You know, one of the most important decisions that you and I can make is who we choose to have an influence upon us. One of the most important decisions we can make, relationships. The most important decision we can ever make is the relationship we have with the Lord. So we need to note that immediately. But in terms of earthly decisions, relationships are certainly one of the top 2 or 3 most important decisions that we will ever make. Because who we invite into our lives, who we allow to enter into that orbit of influence, is going to have a tremendous impact upon us. And sometimes that impact can be really good, and sometimes it can be less than that. In fact, some people, some relationships can be toxic. I read an article one time that was kind of about that, and the title of the article was Relationship Vampires. Now, I decided not to do a message series with that, so I decided a little dark. But relationship vampires. It was about folks who will suck the energy, suck the health, suck the vitality out of you and out of me in dysfunctional, unhealthy relationships. So I want us to think a little bit about that over these next few weeks. So I'm going to title it Relational Detox, Relationship Detox. Of folks that we need to be aware of that can really do damage, to us, more importantly, do damage to our relationship with God. And we're going to look at some case studies within Scripture, as we always do, and apply from Scripture some lessons about these kind of toxic relationships that you and I can slip into with folks. This morning we're going to look at Matthew chapter 16, and just to kind of tee that passage up a little bit, Jesus had just gotten through having a conversation with his disciples around the question of who am I? Who is Jesus? And so he begins, you know, who do folks out there say that I am? And they give him some responses and so on and so forth. And then, of course, as you know from your own knowledge of Scripture, it moves quickly then to Jesus asking them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answers that Jesus is the Christ, right? The Son of God. And Jesus affirms that and then pronounces, you know, on this rock I'll build my church. Very affirming of Peter. One commentator said it was like Peter winning Jesus' Jeopardy. You know, he got it right. He got the answer right. And then, soon thereafter, we find what we're going to look at this morning. And so, let's look at Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 24. It says, from that time on, now that he had given explanation to his apostles and they began to move into an understanding of who he was, as from that time on Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the 3rd day be raised to life. All right, here's the winner of Jesus' Jeopardy. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Now, we don't know everything that Peter said, because the Scripture says began to rebuke him. So what we can kind of have in our mind's eye is Jesus is talking about what's coming. Jesus is talking about what's going to happen in Jerusalem. And we can see Peter kind of midway through what Jesus is saying, kind of maybe take Jesus a little bit by the elbow and say, you know, could you step forward just a minute? I just need to have a word with you for just a second. Don't mean to interrupt, but let's just step over here for just a second. And Scripture says Peter began to rebuke him. Now, the word rebuke there literally means intensive, authoritative judgment. I want you to think about that for just a moment. Peter is giving to Jesus intensive, authoritative judgment. In fact, the only other place where the word rebuke appears is when Jesus is exercising intensive, authoritative judgment over certain things. So, for example, in Scripture it says Jesus rebuked the evil spirits. Elsewhere, when he's out on the Sea of Galilee, it says he rebuked the winds and the waves. He calmed the storm. He exercises intense authority or authoritative judgment over those things. It's the same word that is being used to describe Peter's intensity and his kind of self-rightness here with Jesus. And so we do get a little slice of what Peter said in that conversation. And this is what he said. He says, never, never, Lord. This shall never happen to you. This going to Jerusalem and being killed and all that, that's not, Jesus, that's certain. We're not letting that happen. That's not going to happen. Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." That's pretty tough stuff for the guy that just won Jesus Jeopardy, is it not? Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block, or your translation may have Jesus saying, you are an offense to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. Then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Well, I'm thinking about toxic kind of folks that can easily slip into our lives. This morning I want us to think about controlling people. I don't mean you and I controlling people. I meant people who want to control us. Controlling people. Any of you ever met somebody that's really controlling? 3 of you. Well, wow, this is a great audience. We all met people that are controlling. In fact, Jesus was surrounded by people who so wanted to control him. I mean, at so many turns in Jesus' earthly ministry, there were people that said, Jesus, no, you don't talk to those folks. Jesus, no, we're not going to go there. We're going to go here. Jesus, you don't do that. Jesus, you need to do this. I mean, think of how many times those kinds of things were said to Jesus. In this case, by one of his disciples. In other cases, by folks out in the community. In other cases, by the kind of crusted religious leadership. But there were always folks kind of, orbiting around Jesus, wanting to tell him what to do and what to be and where to go and what to say and how to say it and who to hang out with and who not to hang out with. And then they wanted to control him. Controlling people can be toxic relationships. And this morning, what I want to do is just take a few brief moments and kind of look a little bit at how Jesus responds here to Peter. It's pretty stern, pretty direct, but there are kind of some other things that are going on in this passage that need to preach to us this morning about, how do we deal with controlling people? Because again, that can get really toxic. Controlling people have 2 pretty common weapons that they like to deploy. One is the threat. The threat. Well, if you do that, I'm going to do this. And there are controlling people sometimes in workplaces, sometimes in family systems, and there are controlling people sometimes in churches. Give you an example from my own ministry. I remember the first church I had after I had gotten out of seminary. Been there maybe about 1.5 years. I was, 26, 27 years old, something like that. We're sitting in a church council meeting, and the youth minister he and I had chatted, and he was going to take the youth group that summer on a week-long mission trip. And it was going to, have some cost to it and that kind of thing, because they had to eat and have lodging and this kind of thing. It was going to be out of state. He was very pumped about that. He'd been working, kind of pumping up the youth about this summer mission trip. And he said, Nelson, what I'd like to do is maybe we'll just have a big old church rummage sale, big old yard sale, and kind of promote that for a couple months, let folks bring stuff to a storage room here at the church, and on a Saturday we'll have this rummage sale, raise a little money to help defray the cost of the youth mission trip. I said, that sounds good. We get to church council, and so anyway, Mark, he brings up his idea at this point in time, in the meeting, and there was this guy, and he said, if this church ever has a rummage sale, I'm leaving the church. He was about 3 times my age. I was a little intimidated, I have to admit to you, being 26 and fairly new and pastoring and at that church. And the entire church council capitulated. And so I can remember that we had the rummage sale, but we had it at a vacated gas station near the church, and so folks brought stuff to the church. We stored it in the storage room, and the Saturday before we had the rummage sale, we all got over there and transported from the church all of this really just good stuff, as you can imagine, to the gas station, and had the rummage sale and made it about $1,000, and it helped out and whatnot. I'll have to say, the man that raised the issue never showed up on Friday to help us move anything. That 2 years later, I never forgot that, as I just kind of watched what happened. 2 years later, I'm in a deacons meeting at that church. And I'll just say this, the deacons weren't hitting on all cylinders, and we were sitting around and it was getting time to kind of renominate deacons for the coming year and so on and so forth. And of course, I had grown up in this church. And so I said to the deacons, I think something that would really help our deacon ministry is if we opened the deacon board to women. And anybody that knows anything about church, church doesn't exist if it weren't for women. I will say that. Amen. And so the women at that church were, doing all the ministries. I mean, they were basically visiting the homebound folks. They're the ones that would show up with goodies to folks that were sick or were in the hospital. And, they were teaching the young people and teaching the children and teaching adult Sunday school. I mean, they basically were all over the ministries of the church, except in this one area. And I said, some of the best folks, the best servants that we have at this church are women. And of course, I had grown up here, and we'd had women deacons since the 70s, and so that wasn't a new idea for me personally, and I had real conviction about that women need to be involved in the leadership of the church. So I proposed that, and I said, we don't have to make a decision today, but let's kind of pray about it, think about it, and come back maybe next Sunday, and we'll kind of process a little bit. So they did, and the deacons all said, you know what, we think that's a good idea. We think that's a good idea. I said, well, great, this will help us out and kind of up the deacon ministry in the church. So anyway, word began to kind of sift out a little bit, and we were going to be proposing the deacons and I this change. And guess what the man who didn't want to have the rummage sale came and said to me? If you all have women deacons in this church, my wife and I are leaving the church. Well, I was already on to it. And so I thought I did pretty good for a guy that was now about 27. I said, well, I appreciate the information. And the other deacons had heard him say that to them as well. And so when the deacons met, we were meeting every Sunday. Somebody said, well, what are we going to do about so-and-so? And I said, you know what, we've already made our decision. We're going to proceed. And so we did. We brought it up at the church business meeting. The church overwhelmingly voted to have women deacons. It helped the church. It helped the deacons. helped us in our ministry and mission to the Lord. And guess what? When I left that church after 9 years, he was still there. He was still there. But people who want to control love to use a friend. If you don't do this, you don't do that, you know, and then they'll fill in the blank. So the other tool that they love to use is guilt. And so we have here Jesus with this disciple Peter. And so there are some things here I want to just note in Jesus' response that we need to kind of let sit in us about how do we deal with people who want to control us. Because that, again, can get really toxic. One is, know what you're called to do. Know what you're called to do. You know, Jesus knew with clarity and focus and complete 100% conviction what his mission was, what his purpose was. And it's interesting that Peter's quote-unquote rebuke of Jesus, this intense kind of authoritative response to Jesus, was embedded in Jesus talking about his mission, talking about his purpose, talking about, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to be killed. That should not surprise you, but let me tell you what's going to happen after 3 days. I'm going to raise from the dead. I mean, all of that is aligned with his purpose, with his mission, with why he came to the earth. And when you and I know what our calling is, when you and I know what our purpose is, when we know that with conviction, controlling people can't slip their toxicity into our order. Because let me tell you this, people-pleasing is idolatry. People-pleasing is idolatry. Anytime that you and I think that our purpose in life is to comport and conform ourselves to the opinions of those around us, that's the end game, that's the ultimate priority, we have dethroned God. And we need to be aware of that. Jesus didn't come to earth to please people. He came to earth to do what his Father had sent him to do. You and I have a unique calling, a unique purpose, that when we live in that, then while we might think about or reflect on from time to time the opinions of others, they do not rule. They are not on the throne of our lives. So the first thing that stands out here in Matthew chapter 16 is that Jesus knew what he was called to do, and the same needs to be true of you and me. People's opinion should never be greater than God's calling. Should never be greater than God's calling. Because, you know, calling clarifies. It clarifies. There's a guy by the name of Will Mancini, and he has a blog entitled Life Unique. And the whole thrust of his blog, it's a Christian blog, is to remind believers that God has given to each and every believer a unique purpose and a unique calling. And we need to live in that. He says, your life is something created, designed, given to you by God with mission, with purpose. And that when we live in that, then we have our identity, that every priority, project, penny is filtered through, guided by, and championed by what he calls the life call, which is God's calling, God's purpose upon us. And when we live in that, we live focused. We can then diagnose misalignments. We have a long-term orientation. We have increased passion. We have lifelong dreaming because we know whose we are and the task, the purpose, the mission, the calling that he has gifted us with. And so bear this in mind, that every controlling purpose has someone who has allowed it. So the first strategy know what you're called to do. Know what God has purposed for you. Secondly, recognize when someone is trying to control you. You know what? Jesus doesn't hesitate here. Jesus doesn't get called to the side and say, well, my goodness, you know, that's a good point. Let me think on that. Jesus never once, when somebody came and tried to get in his orbit and control him and tell him what to do and what to be, Jesus never once scratched his head and said, well, you know what? I'm going to think about that this weekend. Jesus recognized immediately when someone was trying to realign him, when someone was trying to get him off purpose, when someone was trying to change his identity in the Father. And you know, we need to be sensitive and have radar to that as well. There's a lady that writes a regular column for Forbes magazine. Now I'm going to baptize this just a bit. She was writing last year about 5 habits of controlling people. And I thought, well, you know, this is pretty good, talking about how to recognize when people are trying to control you. So these were her 5 habits of controlling people. They know what your problem is before you ever tell them. They cannot understand why anyone sees things differently than they do. They get angry when you do not follow their advice. They have personal rules that they expect you to follow. They may not follow them, but they want you to follow. And they rarely see themselves as controlled. Again, does that sound like anybody you've ever met? Do not look at your husband. Do not look at your wife and ask a question like that. But we need to recognize that. We need to have a radar to that. That is what this person saying to me. Is what this person trying to influence me to be or to do or to think, is that in alignment with God's Word and God's will and God's purpose for me? And then finally, know when and how to set boundaries. Know when and how to set boundaries. I mean, Jesus says immediately, you know, get behind me, Satan. Wow. I mean, talk about setting a boundary. Boom. And that lowered one right there. And we need to be willing to do that. Remember, relationships are a combination of what we've created and allowed. And so whoever it is that is influencing us is because of a relationship that we have created with them and we have allowed them to have that level of influence upon us. So we need to know what it is in relationships that we expect and what it is that we are willing to accept. Let me close with this illustration. There's a guy named Elias, and he began his career almost over 100 years ago, back at the turn of the last century. He worked at the Kansas City Star. And he was fired up. He was so excited about his new job and working for the Star. But the editor of the Kansas City Star had told him that he just needed to do and to write the most mundane things for the newspaper. And at first he thought, because he was new and he was young and he got that, he kind of had to work his way into the culture of the Kansas City Star. So he literally got assigned to the obituary desk. And public service announcements, and traffic reports. And so he did that for a while, and then he decided that he would write a little bit, and so he wrote some things and took them into the editor one day, and he said, you know, I would really like to maybe kind of broaden out here a little bit, maybe write some feature stories, some human interest stories. And so he presented a few to the editor. You know what the editor didn't even look at? The editor looked at Elias and said, quote, "You have no imagination or creativity. I've got you exactly where you should be. You've got no imagination or creativity." I just want you to let that hang in the air for just a moment. So Elias kind of sulked back to his desk thinking, I have no imagination or creativity. I'm exactly where I should be. Well, he let a few months go by, and then he decided he'd make one more effort at the editor of the Kansas City Star. And so he took into him some cartoons that he had drawn that he thought were really, really good and funny. And so he'd take these cartoons in, and he said, okay, I realize, maybe I can't write feature stories, but he said, I am kind of artistic. And he said, I thought maybe you might be interested in these and think about running these in our newspaper. Editor didn't hardly glance down at the desk and look back at Elias, and he said, what did I tell you a few months ago? You have no imagination or creativity. No, we don't need these. And just took his hand and slid them right back across the desk before Elias. He goes back to his desk. The editor's words ringing in his ears. You have no imagination